straight up. So I'm going to read to you what I Googled about Sam, Mr. Van Aken, so you can know who's talking to you. And thank you, Candace, for bringing him to my attention. Sam Van Aken is responsible for what is called a tree of 40 fruit. It is one of a series of fruit trees created by the Syracuse University professor Sam Van Aken using the technique of grafting. Now, we all know what that is, but some of us don't do that very well. Connie does it a whole lot better than me. Each tree produces 40 types of stone fruit of the genus Prunus, ripening sequentially from July to October. Okay, so Sam, I'm gonna let you take it from here, and
Great.
thank you again for coming to us.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. And yeah, I thought I would start with talking about how the Tree of 40 Fruit sort of came to be, and just sort of how I, find myself where I'm at the moment. Yeah, have a PowerPoint and we'll just get started. I grew up on a dairy farm in Pennsylvania, near a city called Reading. We milked 200 cows morning and night, and farmed about 400 acres. 200 we owned, and then leased more of it. But all around the barns and the house itself were peach trees, and then also a cherry tree. So in the background in the left, you can see it was a black cherry. From what I can tell, it was either a black Tartarian or black Republican cherry. This is a photo of my mom, her brother, and one of their cousins. That cherry tree always became the backdrop for just about everything that happened on the farm. So there's me at a younger age, and the tree much bigger. But it was always the backdrop for family photographs. And I remember, you can even see in this photograph, you can see these boards propping up the branches on the tree. The tree got so big and became so laden with fruit that the branches would start to pull away from the leader. And I remember we would spend a good amount of time every summer in the middle of harvest season taking a break, putting turnbuckles on the tree, propping it up, just to preserve it. So I don't know if any of you have a background with dairy farming, but it is probably the most difficult work that you could possibly do. Since I was 18, I feel like I've been semi-retired. So after milking cows for all of my life at that point, one of the things that I was looking for is to do something exactly the opposite of it. And from my estimation, that was going to art school. So the other thing that I should also mention is that, we were a family farm. So we had my grandparents' generation, which is the greatest generation, and then my parents, who were, sort of back to the land hippies. So in addition to growing up in a way that was very much sort of 19th century, where we grew everything we ate, we made all of our own clothes. My parents were also very much into the 60s protest movement too. So I grew up with posters like this. So I say that just to explain how I got here, I guess. So in looking for something that was absolutely different, I went to art school, and we'll skip that. And this, believe it or not, was my college ceramics professor. So he did all these amazing things for you. Like, he would say, "What are you doing for spring break? Do you want to go to Europe?" And of course, you were like, "Yeah, I'd love to go to Europe." And you find yourself driving ambulances in Bosnia during the war in the 90s. So it was very unorthodox art education, but it introduced me to dissident artists in communism. So these were artists that it was illegal for them to make art. Um, and they would risk jail time for making art, and that's how much the communist government felt that it had an effect on society. And so all of since they couldn't go buy official materials, what they would do is they would make art out of what was readily available to them. So immediately after I got out of school, I went to Poland and worked with these artists for a year. And it really changed my perception of art. I mean, I think art, a lot of the time gets dismissed as something that, it's not necessarily relevant. Um, but in these countries, art was the most important thing. So it really changed my way of approaching art, and how I looked at it and its importance. So when I got home, I started making art about things that were readily available to me. So this piece is entitled "The Multiple Deaths of William Defoe." So at the time that I made the piece, I took all of the deaths that movie deaths of Willem Dafoe, and created this sort of funeral setting with these flowers that would wilt and die through the course of the exhibition. And there's another detail of it. So I also started doing more of these media-based works. I felt that this was the thing that I knew the most, right? Growing up, in the 80s and 90s. So this is a collection of 500 home stereo speakers. It's 8 feet tall, 50 feet long wall, and it shouts, "Oh my God!" And it's clips of people saying, "Oh my God!" And I was interested in how that phrase means everything from ecstasy to terror to joy to grief. And so here are some images of that. So while I was working on all of these media-based pieces, I started to do my first graphs. So my great grandfather actually made a living as an orchardist, so grafting peach trees, and he grafted a lot of the orchards that were in southeastern Pennsylvania. And I never had the opportunity to meet him, but everyone, when they spoke about him, they spoke about him. They mentioned he knew how to graft as if it was some sort of mystical capability. And my grandfather had actually shown me the process for doing it, where he takes a branch, sticks it on another tree, and says, "Watch this. In 3 weeks, it's going to grow." And sure enough, it did. And I think it was about 8 years old at the time, and it was still the most magical moment that I can remember. So I started to make, I had these pieces of plastic fruit laying around my art studio, and I started to combine them to create these hybrids. Um, but as you combine pieces of plastic fruit, they become highly sexualized. So I was like, okay, I did that 500 times for this exhibition, and I was like, okay, enough of the plastic fruit. Um, so from there, I thought, well, what if I could actually make this real? What if I could, what if I actually started grafting plants together? And so what I would do is take plants that were all within the same family and create these gardens that all grew off of one root structure. So grafting tomatoes to peppers to potatoes, and to have these essentially a garden off of one plant. And the just sort of as they grew, also I would take the fruit and combine them. And I was really happy with the project, although in art you tend to start to think about the long-term survivability or archival quality of the work, which really wasn't there, because these plants all died within 6 months, and it was like, that was a lot of work for a little effort. um, so the other thing that I was heavily influenced with as an artist was the idea of narrative, and how narratives can sort of shape how we experience a place. And I learned about this this author called Karl May, who is the best-selling author in Germany of all time, and like outselling the Bible. And Germans, even to this day, read Karl May, and he wrote about these westerns with this character Old Shatterhand and Winnetou. And Germans will take their 6 month summer vacation and still go play cowboys and Indians in Germany. The interesting thing with Karl May is that he never visited the United States. It was all made up from books that he had read. And he did come to the U.S. eventually he made it as far as Buffalo and it was too much and he went back home. So I got invited to go to Germany and I was following this idea. I was like, well, I'm going to stage a Western. So I started taking photographs. I think any kid that grows up on a farm, you spend lots of your time thinking about being a cowboy. This is me playing harmonica in Walter Benjamin Platz, who's like one of the famous philosophers of Germany. And I had a pony delivered to the German House of Parliament, and then I started riding that around. And the interesting thing that happened with as I was riding the pony is this photographer came up and said, "Can I take a photograph?" And I didn't give it really much thought. Um, and the next day, I started getting emails from around the world, from Japan, Australia, and it turns out the photographer was from Reuters. And I thought, as an artist, I have a art gallery in New York City. Um, maybe 3,000 people will see an exhibition, and just doing this one project that was not inside of a gallery reached an audience that I don't know even how large it was, millions and millions of people. So it made me start to think about how could I have an artwork that functioned sort of like a rumor. And that reminded me of the 1938 War of the Worlds broadcasts. And I don't know if you're familiar with this story, but on the night before Halloween, Orson Welles staged a radio broadcast, um, saying that aliens landed in the small town of Grover's Mills, New Jersey. And I was driving through New Jersey to get to New York City, and I discovered there was actually a town named Grover's Mills, and this was Mr. Grover's home. And in the back of Mr. Grover's home was this water tower that on the night of the radio hoax, the good citizens of Grover's Mills went out shotguns in hand looking for the aliens, mistook this standpipe in the back of Mr. Grover's yard and blasted a whole bunch of holes in it. So this has become this whole sort of like cult thing that people go to visit. And, I asked the homeowner, the current homeowner, for permission to take photographs. And she said, "Oh, thank you for asking. Nobody asked. Somebody tripped on my pool cover and is now suing me. I wish I could get rid of this damn thing." And I said, "I'm just your guy. I'll take that." So I got a radio tower and I proceeded to make my own radio hoaxes that got played in Buffalo, New York, the site of a 1976 War of the World broadcast. But the problem is that the FCC doesn't take kindly to you playing your own radio without licensing and so forth. And the project got shut down before it could even really get started. So I really like that idea of the hoax, right? And this idea, I was really interested in that tower. At one point, it was a windmill, then it became a standpipe, and then on the night of the radio broadcast, it became this alien ship. And I looked in, I knew I couldn't do more radio hoaxes, so I looked into what the term hoax meant. And hoax comes from hocus pocus, which in turn comes from a line in the Catholic Eucharist where the priest says, "Hoc est enim corpus meum." And it's the point at which the priest says, "This is my body" over the bread, and transforms it into the body of Christ. And I thought, man, what could I do to transubstantiate? Like what could be like that tower, or what could be like that piece of bread? And going into it with this sort of knowledge of grafting and this idea, to kind of change the reality of a thing, I developed the Tree of 40 Fruit project. So the Tree of 40 Fruit is a single tree that produces 40 different types of stone fruit. That includes peaches, plums, apricots, nectarines, cherries, and almonds. So it's meant, for the majority of the year, it's meant to be a normal looking tree or somewhat normal looking tree until spring, when it blossoms in all of these different colors of pink and white. And then in summer bears a multitude of fruit. And so the process that I use for creating the trees, it's simple. I just do whip grafting. I'll collect scion wood or branches that I want to graft onto the tree uh, about this time every year. So mid-January, I'll go out, collect scion wood, store it in plastic bags in a refrigerator, keep it between 34 to 38 degrees. And those branches will hold until the tree starts to break dormancy in spring. At which point I can take that scion wood and graft it onto the ends of the branches of the tree and sort of build the tree out. So typically, whip grafting, which you see here, is done onto a new root structure. Um, Fruit trees, they are not genetically stable, right? Which means that the seed that they produce will vary greatly from the parent. Apples in particular are the most genetically unstable, which if you took, you know, 100 pieces of fruit, pulled 5 seeds from each piece of fruit, planted them all out, you would come up with 500 distinct apple varieties. Now, a lot of them probably won't be as good as the parent, and it's the reason why grafting is still performed to this day, because it's the only way to continue to propagate the trees. Typically, what I'll do is I'll collect scion wood that's 1/4 inch thick, and I will graft it onto rootstock. Most of the time, I'll get commercially grown rootstock that's 1/4 inch. I find that pencil sized stock works really well. And one of the things that I do is to wrap the graft, I actually use electrical tape because the electrical tape will hold for the first, few years. And as uh, as the trunk of the tree continues to expand, it pushes the electrical tape off. I can just walk by, collect it, several years down the line. So, yeah, as I mentioned, grafting has a really long history. It wasn't necessarily performed in the US until the early 19th century. Uh, most fruit trees in the early United States were peaches that were grown in order to feed livestock, or cider apples, uh, that people would make alcohol from. So it wasn't until about 1830 there was a nursery in New York City called Prince Nurseries, and they started to introduce a lot of French orchard techniques, and so grafting started to become really popular, or more popular. And so the interesting thing is that when I started the project, I couldn't find 40 different varieties of stone fruit in New York State. And that's despite the fact that New York, in the early 20th century, so 1911, was the second leading producer of stone fruits in the country. And it was at that point I was introduced to the extent to which we've created monocultures across the country, where New York shifted to focusing on apples. And it wasn't until I found a research orchard that I was able to find, the quantity that I was looking for. The problem was that they were planning to tear this orchard out, and so I worked with the university and was able to collect varieties and grafted them onto trees in my nursery. So you can see my nursery really isn't that big. It's 2,000 to 3,000 square feet, and it has hundreds of trees in it, and probably 400 or 500 varieties of fruit are contained within it. What I'll do when I start the Tree of 40 fruit is I'll make that initial graft, which you can see in the pots on the left. What I do is the first, year or two that the trees are growing out, I'll keep them potted, and I'll gradually move them to larger containers by doing root pruning on them. So once the tree gets to three years or so from its initial graft, I'll head it off, which means that I'll take out the central leader and have 4 to 5 scaffolding branches that come off the side. And what I can do is graft onto those scaffolding branches almost as if they're rootstock and continue to grow the tree. Typically, what I'll use is a plum as the base tree. Use a Santa Rosa plum, or which those trees they're incredibly durable. or I'll use if it's in a colder climate, I'll either use a Stanley plum developed here in New York, or a Damson plum, uh, which is, that's a 2,000-year-old fruit variety. This is typically what the trees look like when they're planted. I plant them, I tend not to plant trees if the caliper is bigger than 1.5 inches. I find that the time you spend planting a larger tree and the amount of care that you have to put into it, a smaller tree will outgrow it in that time frame. So, these trees are smaller. They usually have, 15 varieties grafted to them at this point. And so this is what they look like about 6 or 7 years later, with all 40 varieties grafted onto them in spring. The blossom starts, not all of the varieties blossom at the same time in a typical year. Sometimes here in New York, we get these crazy winters that'll last right up till mid-April. Then all of a sudden it's 70 degrees and the trees blossom all at once, and it's amazing. But in a typical year, they blossom across 2 to 3 weeks. And what I realized I could do is I could essentially design how the tree blossoms, right? The shape of how it blossoms, and as it fills in. So here's some details of the blossoming. And each of the trees has, I have a diagram, and the color coding is based on what year the graft was placed onto the tree. And that way I can track, which varieties are outperforming others. Typically when doing these multi-grafted trees, if you graft, say, an Asian plum variety, and you're working off a Santa Rosa plum, which is also an Asian plum, those are going to grow much faster, right? They readily take, and you'll see vigorous growth. So what I tend to do is I'll graft apricots in the very center of the tree, peaches sort of in the middle canopy, and keep all plums out on the perimeter. And what that does is it'll keep my trees growing out rather than up. And I always use the vase shape open center trees, because I find that I can get more branches per tree on them. So this is what they look like as they start to fruit. And so they'll start off with cherries in June, July, shift into apricots, then Asian plums, European plums will start, peaches, and it closes out the year with a few European plums. And I've gotten into winter peaches. So there's a couple peaches that hold really well. In fact, one of the oldest varieties in the United States is called the Heath Cling peach, and I can harvest those in October, and I can still, I have a little cold cellar, and I can keep them in there until after the first of the year. So it definitely expands, how long you can keep fruit. It keeps much like an apple in that regard. So here's some details as the trees start to fill in with fruit. So it's interesting because when I first started this, I thought nobody would want these trees. But then more and more people started to ask for them, and it was really supported by art collectors. They were the ones that really kind of supported the project for a while. But after the first few years of doing it, I realized that I was putting all this effort. Like, after I plant a tree, what I do is I come back 3 to 5 years to continue to graft and prune the tree to make sure it gets established. And I was like, this is a lot of work just for one person. So I shifted to just doing public projects. And what I'll do is, as I get invited to a different location, I research varieties that have been historically originating or historically grown in that region, and I graft them onto the tree so that in a way it becomes an agricultural history of the region, and a way to preserve, what are probably rare varieties. And so that's led to, trees, sort of all over the place. Um, and Yeah, so I have a pretty busy spring where I travel to go to each of the trees. And the thing I think that's most enjoyable about it is that I get to meet a lot of growers. A lot of these growers they're an older generation that their kids, wanted to move on. It was much like me, sort of wanting to go on to something else. And they're in this incredible wealth of knowledge that they they were yeah, I've been fortunate for them to pass on to me. So I guess it was like 4 years into the project. I nothing was really much happening. So I started to shift gears, and I started to shift to looking at the weather. Um, I was talking to my mom one day, and I was like, "Mom, I can't come visit. I gotta water trees." And she was like, "You're just like your grandfather." And she tells me this story of that. We had a drought one year, and all of our money was in seed in the ground, and it looked like we were going to lose the crop, and that means you're going to lose the farm. And she found him like crying and praying, and just to get a reprieve to change the weather. And I thought, well, what if you can change the weather? And so at the time, I started to find these images on the internet of these things called punch hole clouds, and like everything else on the internet, people thought it was, either aliens or Russians, and I was suspecting that it was probably not. And I figured out that it was occurring when these altocumulus clouds were forming. And so this cloud layer, they call them mackerel sky. They look like fish scales, and I found out that they were actually altocumulus clouds that occur 6 to 12 hours before a storm hits. And that so I learned how to take these weather forecasts, read them to get that cloud layer. I found a pilot, and we would fly around Syracuse, New York, and we would put holes in clouds. And what causes those punch hole clouds is when a plane flies through the cloud deck, and it forces these tiny water droplets to fall out as rain. So I then figured out that I could do it with a weather balloon. And so what I do is launch weather balloons up, and it has a payload that puts sea salt into the cloud, and it forms water droplets and falls out. And the interesting thing with the project is that I don't even need to do it anymore, because people send me these pictures all the time from all over the world, and they're like, "Did you put a punch hole cloud here?" And yeah, so this is a friend that was recently in Ireland sends me this photo. So I had been working on the weather project for a while. Then all of a sudden, the Tree of 40 Fruit. I had done a few talks, and one of them was online, and it, I guess like viral is the term for it. And then the image, so I had done this artist rendering of what the tree would look like, after 10 to 20 years. And it started to show up everywhere. So some psychologists in Indiana used this on their website to try to, get people to come in for marriage counseling. I got an interview on NPR, and I didn't realize that, everybody in the government listens to NPR. So, right after the NPR interview, I got a call from the USDA, who was asking what the hell I was doing. But then I also got a call from the Department of Defense, who were like, "We'd like you to come down and speak with us." And it turned, it was really weird, because you always hear DARPA is like some evil, group or something. And They were interested in food security. And it turns out that food security is a major national security threat now that we've narrowed down our crops, so fruits and vegetables, to a handful to a dozen varieties of each type of crop. If something happens to one of those varieties, it can have a major impact on the food chain. So they wanted me to talk to them about what I was doing. And in many ways, I knew that I had a lot of fruit varieties, but I didn't know that I had one of the largest collections in the Eastern United States. And so this is just an example of some of these are plums that come from one tree of 40 fruit in 1 week in August. So that gives you an idea of the diversity that the trees produce. And it really started, all of a sudden I felt like I had an incredible responsibility to maintain and preserve these varieties. So in addition to keeping them growing and grafted onto these different trees, I started to become really interested in the stories, the origin of these fruit. So this is the blood cling peach that was brought by Spanish missionaries in the 1500s into Mexico. It was then cultivated by Native Americans for 2 centuries before Europeans show up, and they compare it to a French variety and find out that it was, they call it a blood peach because when you bite into it, it has red flesh. Other stories are, apricots that were brought by Chinese immigrants who came to work on the Transcontinental Railroad. Other varieties like the Asian were brought back from crusaders to a monastery in France. 2 brothers go to California to work for the gold rush and introduce it, and becomes still the most popular variety of prune in the United States today. So I became interested in capturing the story of these fruit. And the way that I knew for doing that was artwork. So as orchards were being torn out, I would go in and take the bowl section. So this is the trunk where it transitions from rootstock to the actual variety you want to grow. I started creating herbarium specimens or pressings of each of the varieties. First, they took the form of these frame pieces, and currently I'm creating voucher specimens. So these are actual scientific pressings that include the blossom, the branch, the seed. So this is a black Tartarian peach or black Tartarian cherry, similar to the one that was at my family's farm. This is Ping Tao. It's the original flat peach. You might know them more commonly as Saturn, Galaxy, or Donut peaches. They actually originated in China thousands and thousands of years ago. This is a blood leaf peach, so a red leaf peach that they're now using as a rootstock. There's a rootstock called Citation. So that way you know when the graft is taken or whether the rootstock is suckering. In addition to that, I started creating cyanotypes similar to Anna Atkins did. I guess it was like the 1820s. She used cyanotypes to create pressings of algae. And so I thought this was another form of being able to document and record these fruit. And in a lot of ways, this almost became kind of like, it's really sad, but like an elegy to all of these fruit that are disappearing. I then built a print studio in my basement and started making copper plate etchings and doing letterpress descriptions of the fruit, similar to the 19th century. Just another way of documenting them, and in that I would tell that story of their origin and sort of how they appeared, and how they came to the United States. I mean, with the exception of Prunus americana, a native plum variety, choke cherry, and a few other types of prunus, the majority of the fruit that we now consume all came here from somewhere else. So it's really a story of migration and people that brought these fruit to our shores as a connection to their home. The other thing that I've been doing is getting into the mythology and folklore that surrounds these fruit. So these were, I read this story about how if you went out in the middle of an eclipse, collected branches from a peach tree, this is a Chinese myth, you soak them in salt water until the next new moon, you pull them out and you hang them from a red string. The literal translation of them is called wands, and this could be seen as the the origin of the magic wand. Some people in China still do that. They hang them over their door at New Year's, and the idea is that you can ward off evil spirits from your home at the time of the new year. So after collecting all this information and all these fruit varieties, I realized that it really wasn't doing any good unless I was getting it out to people. So I started to work on creating a public orchard, and I was shopping the project around everywhere. I was looking for a place in the Hudson Valley here in New York. Ideally, I wanted something in New York City, so I started asking people, for an acre of land in New York, and like they just laughed at me. And you know, it wasn't until I was approached by Governor's Island. So this is an old naval base, Coast Guard station off the southern tip of Manhattan. It was given to the city in 2000, and it created 178 acres of land that they couldn't develop or use for commercial reasons within New York Harbor. And they asked me to develop a project. And so what I'm currently working on is the open orchard. And this will be 100 trees. They'll be multi-grafted, so they'll contain 400 to 500 varieties that originated or were historically grown in New York City. New York City could be argued to be the home of fruit growing in the United States. Before first contact, Native Americans cultivated Chickasaw plums, Prunus maritima, which is the beach plum, and Prunus americana up and through the Hudson Valley. When the first Dutch explorers came, they brought cherry pits with them. Native Americans quickly started to grow them up and down the Hudson Valley as well. The first Dutch colonial governor of Manhattan, Stuyvesant, planted a pear tree at his property on 13th Street and 3rd Avenue. And the tree grew for 220 years until it was hit by a wagon and ultimately sort of perished. New York is home to the Newton Pippin apple, which was the first commercial international global apple variety. It was found as a seedling or pippin in Flushing, Queens, and it was grown throughout the colonies, and it became the first apple that was sent to monarchs in Europe. They loved the taste of it so much that they would send barrels and barrels to Europe. Other varieties, the Washington Gage plum is another variety that we're bringing back. There was a tree it was a green gage tree that was struck by lightning, and from that suckering root structure came a different variety of plum that became a major commercial variety throughout the 19th century. And if you're not familiar with gage plums are a fresh eating type of plum. They tend to be smaller than a prune plum, and before the introduction of Asian plum varieties, gage plums were the fresh eating varieties that everyone had. The most common of which is the Ron Claude or the green gage. Other peaches like the George IV. So somebody is walking on Wall Street, early 19th century, eating an old Mixon peach, takes the pit, throws it between two buildings, it grows. Somebody walks by, tastes it. It's an amazing peach. They take seeds from it. It quickly becomes a major variety across the United States. And then by the 1940s, it's down to one single tree that provided scion wood, and it is now being shared among people who collect fruit trees. So with this public orchard, what I'm looking at is creating it's the orchard, right? The orchard becomes this experiential setting. I mean, I don't know of any place more beautiful than an orchard in spring as it starts to blossom. but it's also a place for workshops. So we're having workshops where we teach people how to plant, prune, do pest management, everything that surrounds the life of the tree. And we're doing that with New York City Park. So I've been doing virtual workshops with them. We have another one coming up at the end of the month that's just on pruning trees. The other thing is doing fresh eating tours. And then also what we're planning on doing is partnering with chefs to recreate dishes that these fruit were specifically grown for. In doing research on the varieties and finding out where they originated and trying to trace this history, I've come across recipes that were built around the fruit variety, such as this one. So this is plum clafouti, where you grease a skillet, cast iron pan. You sugar, you take Asian plums. For these, I actually use some Mirabelle plums that I had that are amazing. Soak those in brown sugar, and then use a batter that's very similar to like a pancake type batter. Bake it in the oven for an hour, and it rises, and you have to eat it within the first half hour before it drops back down. So this is a very traditional French dish that a lot of the prune plums are used for. I've also been getting recipes wherever I can. I got a plum chutney recipe from one of my students. Their mother is in India. She sent me this recipe that I recreated, and it is extraordinary. It is unlike any type of chutney that you've ever had before. It's sweet, it's spicy. And so finally, like, one of the last things that I'm working on is an album of pomology, which were really popular in the 19th century, and they were in many ways used to promote fruit varieties that were being introduced in the United States. And I thought, well, given that we've narrowed the number of these types of fruit that we're growing, it might be good to reintroduce these varieties again through another album. We're going to be planting the open orchard in this fall of 2021, and we're going to have a public opening spring of 2022. We got pushed back a year by the virus, but the trees don't seem to mind. So we have a couple minutes left, so I'll show you another project that I'm working on. I've been working with a Japanese biotech firm on doing interspecific grafting. And we discovered that Nicotiana, or the root of nicotine, that it's a model plant, right? So it's been heavily researched, and it has a tremendous capability for grafting across different families. So you can see, all the things that we've been grafting onto the Nicotiana, pine trees, soy, broccoli, and the other plant that has that capability also is petunias. So you can take and graft different flower varieties onto petunias. So what we've been doing is doing trials. So these are all lab trials, greenhouse tests. And my interest in it is that I want to go back to that initial project that I had done with vegetables and grafting vegetables together. And I want to create an entire cornucopia that grows off of one root structure, and to recreate things like these Dutch still lives of the 18th century. But the other thing that we're also working on right now is doing trials with desert plants to see if we can graft Nicotiana onto desert trees, which have long tap roots that tie down into aquifers, and then to graft vegetables onto those trees to see if we can actually grow food in the desert. So that's what I do. So
okay.
good.
I'm unmuting myself here. First of all, I'm just like amazed. The Governor's Island project looks too incredible to me. And I have some of my own questions, but there's some questions in the chat feature. So let me get there. And
Okay.
Candace wants to know, do you do bud grafting at what time of year and at what age?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think I've moved away from bud grafting, mostly because I think just the climate that I'm in upstate New York. I've found that with the winters we have, it just really does a number on the branches. Really strong winds. And so what I'll do is I'll actually do bud grafting in the spring.
Okay.
So most of the time they do peaches. You'll do peaches between the second week in July and the end of August are the cutoff dates. If I was in Texas, I would be doing a tea budding, right, where you're cutting open the bark and sliding the shield down in. That way you're going to keep the bud from desiccating. But I mean, where you're at, bud grafting mid-July to the end of August is great. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. And she wants to know, do you ever use peaches as your rootstock?
No, I kind of veered away from that. I tried it for a few years, but the problem is one, longevity. So peach tree, you peach trees will last 15 to 20 years. Typically that seems to be the lifespan, at least of modern varieties. And the other thing that I found is that with rootstock, what I want is a really strong scaffolding. So I want something that's going to put a lot of energy into the growth of the branches, and something that's going to be able to carry all the weight. And I found that peaches they'll split pretty quick. When you start to get quite a few varieties on them.
So not peaches. Okay.
Yeah.
She says, can you preserve the scion to graft? And it's when you were talking about you were going around and collecting them. So
Yeah.
how long do you keep them before you use them?
I've collected scion wood in January and I've used it in July. Right. And so you can keep it, they say 6 months. I've stretched it to 7. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as a practice. What I typically do is I'll collect in January and I'll be using them by mid-April at the latest. And what I'll do is I time my grafting all around the tree. So when it gets to bud swell, that's when I'll start grafting. And the other thing is that a old timer told me is that you never want to graft after the leaves are bigger than a mouse's ear, which I'm still trying to figure out what size that is, but I think it's a pretty good indication. Like, when it's larger than a mouse's ear, right?
Yes. Okay. Okay. We still have more questions. With all the varieties growing on one tree, what pruning method do you use?
Oh, I mean, again, I'll do open center. And what I do is I just try to keep, pushing everything out. I do dormant pruning. So typically what I'll do is I'll prune January, about the time that I'm collecting scion wood. But then also I do quite a bit of summer pruning as well. So I'll go in, but I'll never cut into old wood. With summer pruning, I only prune away that year's growth. Anything that's older than a year that's on the tree, I'll hold off on that until till winter.
Okay.
Yeah.
Would you share your plum chutney recipe with us?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I have permission. I asked my student's mother if it was okay to share, and she said it was okay.
Okay.
So yeah, I
So
can email it to you.
you can email it to me and then I can
Yeah.
share it. Okay. Do you ever air layer?
No.
No. Okay. That's
Yeah.
short and simple answer. Are any of the workshops online for other people?
Oh yeah. So New York City Parks has this organization called Green Thumb. And if you go onto the Green Thumb site, you can sign up for their mailing list, and they'll let you know when when the workshops are available. Typically, we'll do one at the end of January, and then we'll do one grafting in March. We're you know, you're probably gearing up to graft by next month, but yeah, we have to hold on for a while. You know, we do then through the summer, May, June, July, August, we have one a month.
Okay, thank you.
And
That sounds good.
the cooking
I,
one's good because it's a disaster. It's like watching a train wreck.
it's a train wreck watching me do it at all. Period. So okay. I have a couple more questions written down here. How long does one of your trees survive?
Yeah, I mean that's a question. So they're you know, a typical plum tree, the life expectancy is anywhere around 40 to 50 years for it. Um, so yeah, that's sort of the base tree is the big determinant on that. And it's also I finally conceded, and after years of saying disparaging things about apples, like they're nothing but tree potatoes and that sort of thing, I've finally gotten into apples, you know. So I've started to grow apples just really out of longevity, right? To have trees that last a while, and I've really been focused on rare, you know, going to like rare parent varieties of today's apples.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Ohio, so
Oh,
northeastern Ohio apple trees are everywhere. But it was always they have a shorter lifespan. I mean, the wood's soft and they don't last all that long. And I mean, some of them do if you don't do anything. But yes, it seemed like the people that owned orchards were constantly changing those trees
hmm.
out because that was it. But I was kind of surprised about that.
Well, I
Um,
don't. Have you seen how they grow apple trees now? It's very similar to grapes. So they're super dwarf trees. They grow them on wires. The trees only get about 8 feet tall, maybe produce 50 to 100 apples, but it's one central leader, and 2.5 feet away is another one. And it's just sort of, it's a little shocking to see that.
Odd, yes, but I guess it's easier to pick and maintain and
Hmm.
do all the things they need to do.
Yeah,
You don't
yeah,
get
it
that big,
is.
beautiful apple tree anymore with all those apples that you have to have a 40-foot ladder to go get.
Yeah.
When you were showing your map of where you have trees of 40 around the country, I didn't see anything like south of like Missouri. Is that because you don't think it's a good idea for down here?
Oh no, I'm doing one in right on the Texas Louisiana border.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
just starting this year. So
So
yeah,
we could take a trip to see it. Where's what town is that?
Orange, Texas.
That's not that far from us. Yes, that's
Okay.
not that far from
Well,
us.
the tree just went into the ground this year, so it'll be a year or two before we get grafts on it. And sort of what I've started to do, I mean tree is going to be you know, it has to be low chill varieties.
Uh-huh.
So it took me a while to research enough low chill varieties that I could graft to it. And what we're doing with that one is rather than me bringing a tree from New York, where it's, I mean, I still grow Santa Rosa plums here, but I think that try to get the tree as close to where it's going to be placed. So we're actually starting with a nursery tree and then grafting onto it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So how are you
But yeah,
dealing with hurricanes and how are you going to deal with hurricanes and flooding? Orange is pretty bad for that kind of thing.
yeah, that's what they said. I'm like, you need to put that on a really tall hill.
Yeah, really.
Yeah, I
Exactly.
know. They got hit like 3 times this year. I'm like, do you guys ever get a break from this? But yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty bad. It's pretty bad. Let me see if I have any more questions written down. Oh, one last question. Your desert project that looked very interesting. What state is that in?
Oh, so those images were actually taken in the United Arab Emirate. So in the UAE,
Okay,
outside
that's
of
not
Abu
what
Dhabi.
state that in. Okay.
Yeah. And so what we've done is that's all we've done the field trials and recreated the climate in the greenhouse. But due to the coronavirus, we haven't been able to actually get to the field trials. So who knows what state it's in or where it's going to be when we can finally travel again.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Um,
been tough.
Yeah, well, the pandemic has done a whole lot for everybody.
Yeah.
And not all of it great. Some of it is good, but not all of it great. Are any of the trees for sale to the public?
Usually what I'll do is I'll if someone's interested, like partner with them on trying to to place it somewhere in the public. And what I'm doing now is encouraging people, like I'm doing a book with Timber Press this year, and it's going to have all the directions on how to make a tree of 40 fruit. And I would encourage people to make their own, because otherwise it gets really expensive traveling places.
Yeah.
And yeah, it kind of becomes really cost prohibitive. But yeah, if there's a public area that's interested.
So the
You
the
wanna
one
work
in
on it?
orange is somehow is through an entity or the government or something over there.
Yeah. Yep.
It's not a privately owned tree. It's a
It's
public.
yeah, it's kind of like privately owned but open to the public,
Okay.
that sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll have to keep in touch and make sure we know when the orange one opens, because like I said, that's not that far from us. We're on the opposite side of Houston.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's not bad.
No, not at
Oh,
all.
that you've got a great fruit growing. That's a great region.
Well, we try.
Do you do a lot of almonds?
Um, I don't. Anybody else in here want to chime in on doing any almonds?
I have 2 trees, 2 almond
Oh,
trees since last year.
oh, that's great.
Yeah, I do as
I know our
well.
Master Gardener sales, we sold almond trees. Mary, do you do almonds?
I do, but they're not doing very well because they don't like the humidity and the short spring that we have. But they're doing fine, but they're not gonna produce much.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody
almonds
else
are.
have?
Oh,
Um,
yeah, I grow a couple of varieties that came out of Russia from the 90s that are cold hardy. So yeah, I don't get many, but the ones I get, I cherish.
Well, we sold them at our Master Gardener tree sale this year. So, that's something we offered, and our tree committees always make sure that what we offer is what will grow in our area, not,
Yeah.
not like going to the big box store and they just have everything
Yeah.
there. People go home and buy them and go, sorry, this really wasn't going to work well in your area.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it's almost 10 o'clock and I don't see anybody. Oh, Candace wants one more question. What would it take to get one in Hempstead? That's our town.
Oh. Oh, we'll have to talk about that.
Well,
But yeah, let me look into
yeah.
it, and I'll look at grow zones too.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming. I'll do the virtual
thank
applause
you.
for everybody here. And send us the recipe for the chutney, and
Absolutely.
we'll be in touch to find out when the orange one is open to the public.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
thank
Have
you for
a
inviting
great
me.
day. Have a great new year.
You too. All right.
Thank
We'll
you.
see
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, everybody. We're still here. Connie is now going to be the person that's going to be in charge. But I think we should take 5. Don't hang up. Don't go away. Take 5. Go to the bathroom, stretch your legs, do whatever you have to, get another cup of coffee or whatever. And then we'll come back and do our meeting.
I'm
Sounds
gonna
good.
go ahead and stop the recording because y'all
Yeah.
don't need it recorded for the meeting, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Connie, I made you a co-host as well.
I'm sorry, say that again.
I made you a co-host
Okay.
in case you needed to share your screen or anything.
Oh, okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Stacy.
You're welcome.